lot of nuts!
Ah, the never-ending cringe of pirate software. The Stop Killing Games signatures have just crossed over 1 million people signed up to put an end to live service games being taken away after being paid for, and for some reason the only thing that anybody can talk about is one particular streamer whose ego is so large he currently has DMs in his inbox from Will Smith himself asking if he'd like to have 3 children, one of which deciding to be not as famous as the rest of the family for some reason. Stop Killing Games is a consumer movement that was started by YouTuber Ross Scott, and is basically a petition that is designed to fight against anti-consumer practices in video game culture. It was launched after the discontinuation of the video game The Crew, which was designed to be an online multiplayer racing game, but for the most part was pretty much entirely single player and yet still required an online connection. And after Ubisoft pulled the plug on its online servers, stating costs and licensing issues, this video game that was mostly single player that people paid money to be able to play was now effectively dead, and you could no longer play this video game that you paid for. This movement started to garner a lot of traction in the last few months, with the deadline for people to sign up for it closely approaching, as well as recognition of the movement being improved by many big YouTubers speaking about the movement, such as Moist Critical, PewDiePie, aka the new god of Linux, and Jacksepticeye, aka Green PewDiePie. I'm sure even with this completely surface level explanation of what Stop Killing Games is about, many of you guys already understand why a movement such as this would be held so important to many people online, because at its core, Stop Killing Games is about video game preservation, and obviously anybody who cares even a little bit about video games probably wants to make sure that they can continue to play video games for as long as possible, especially if they've already paid for it. With Nintendo effectively normalizing new video games being $70 or $80, and God knowing I'm gonna have to sell a kidney to be able to afford Grand Theft Auto 6 when it inevitably comes out, it's becoming more and more important for people who are spending this kind of money on video games to have a better understanding of what the roadmap is gonna be like for the life of that video game. With more and more video games requiring some sort of internet connection for you to be able to play them, even if you're not playing in multiplayer, shouldn't publishers be required to let you know if they already have plans for this video game to no longer be able to be played 6 months down the road? 6 years down the road? Before we get into the rest of the video, let me give a quick thank you to today's video sponsor, Into the AM, and happy 4th of July, everybody! I hope you're eating as many hot dogs and hamburgers as possible. But while you're doing such, why not also head over to Into the AM, where they're currently offering up to 60% off the entire website, including all of their newest graphic tees, which you guys see me wear in a huge number of my videos over the last couple of years. If you're not familiar with Into the AM, they're a California-based apparel company, and they've got everything from button-up shirts to socks and underwear, graphic tees, and more. Perfect for this summer heat, and you guys can purchase whatever you like to on their website using my link in the description for an extra 10% off. They're already site-wide up to 60% off, massive savings. You guys can look great while getting ketchup all over your shirts, and you'll be supporting the channel at the same time. A big thank you to Into the AM. Now, I'm sure this conversation about live service games going offline probably reminds you guys of Concord, the Overwatch clone multiplayer FPS published by Sony that went offline just 2 weeks after the game went live, seemingly due to a lack of popularity. Thankfully, this was such an egregiously short period of time that the 35 people that paid to be able to play Concord were subsequently issued refunds. But it does raise the question, how long does a video game need to be playable before it's okay for the publisher to keep your money? 2 weeks is ridiculous, but what if it's only 2 months? What if it's only 2 years? How long does a video game need to be playable for before you feel like you didn't pay money just to rent the thing? Obviously, when we're talking about online exclusive video games, games that are designed to be played in multiplayer, the concept that the server should be online forever is a teeny bit ridiculous. I mean, if you are the only person playing an online video game, does it make sense that a publisher would continue to pay what might be tens of thousands of dollars a month to keep their server online so that you can continue to farm fruit in a dead video game? Probably not. But on the contrary, how online does a video game need to be for them to be able to say, hey, we're allowed to take this offline? If there's an entire video game that you can play offline, such as The Crew or Grand Theft Auto 4, with only a minimal online experience for multiplayer or a multi-transactional store, if that part of the game goes down and you can't even play the single player part of the game that doesn't require an internet connection, isn't that something you would like to know before spending what might be $80, $90, or $100 on a video game going forward? It's this sort of clarification that Stop Killing Games is making an effort to try to get publishers to be more transparent about. This way, it would encourage them to be able to let consumers know, hey, we're only planning on having this game to be live for 2 years, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do for that point on. Or hopefully discourage publishers as a whole from introducing online-only aspects into video games that work just fine single player, letting people continue to play those video games without the online component. Better still, in a perfect world, publishers would provide tools for people to be able to continue playing these games with their own support if the publishers themselves decide not to. Think about custom Halo 2 or Halo 3 lobbies. You can host an online server for other people to play on that's got little to nothing to do with Bungie themselves, and that way you can continue to enjoy a game that you love and have paid for. Obviously, all of this makes sense. If you pay for a video game, you should be able to play the thing. You're not renting the software, you're purchasing it for your personal use. And why wouldn't a publisher want you to play a video game for 10 or 20 years after they made it? That just shows how much you love all the work that they put into making the thing. Who would disagree with this other than the internet's #1 punching bag? To be fair, he did work at Blizzard. Introducing our main antagonist into this story, Pirate Software. Almost exactly a year ago at this point, Pirate Software uploads a video to his YouTube channel titled Stop Killing Games, talking about the petition Stop Killing Games, in which he states that it's bad. Pirate Software's main points are that the goals of this petition are too vague to be taken seriously, and the idea that games should last forever, which is sort of a weird summarization of a point that isn't really being made by the Stop Killing Games movement, is a bit too ridiculous. The idea that any live service game, such as World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV or League of Legends, if this sort of legislation were to pass requiring publishers to make sure that their games run forever, any sort of online multiplayer game would effectively cease to exist, because game publishers wouldn't want to make a game that they have to continue to dump money into keeping online and running forever. Ironically, it seems to be the point that Pirate Software is making to be that the Stop Killing Games movement would effectively be killing games. I'll let you figure out why that one doesn't make sense. Pirate Software is primarily a Twitch streamer, where he streams video games and also the coding of his own video game live on Twitch, but he grew to prominence by utilizing YouTube Shorts, where he would be posting these short vertical videos utilizing his deep voice and his 7 years of experience working at Blizzard on games like Overwatch and World of Warcraft to explain to us, the common folk, the back end and the behind the scenes mechanics of how video games and even social media work to great success. These YouTube Shorts would garner hundreds of millions of views over the course of just a few years. All of this to put himself in a position of expertise, this person who has spent time working on some of the video games that you have probably played at one of the biggest video game companies, and even being an indie dev himself, it became all the more surprising that somebody who has spent this much time working on video games would take such a contrarian stance against this movement that seems to be making an effort to try to preserve the very video games you've spent your whole life working on. What's going on here? The European Citizens Initiative on the Stop Killing Games website makes 3 major points for what they want to try and change with this position, that being requiring video games sold to remain in a working state after support ends, requiring no connections to the publisher after the support ends, and to not interfere with any business practices while a game is still being supported. Obviously, it's a pretty gross mischaracterization of these very clear points to try to make a video stating that this would effectively end live service games in their entirety. The fact that a video game has an online component doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be supported for the next 200 years, and yet still, Pirate Software, as somebody who has worked on the biggest multiplayer games to ever exist, saw these points and for some reason decided this would be the absolute worst possible thing for video games in history. industry, and as a result sort of ended up as the face and the mascot against Stop Killing Games. Having made a video that at this point has over 1 million views dunking on the Stop Killing Games movement, it effectively made Pirate Software look like the #1 reason why this petition wouldn't move forward without enough signatures, because there was such a loud voice speaking up against it. Seemingly completely unaware of the fact that his audience is primarily people who love video games and or are capable of doing their own research and coming to their own conclusions without an artificially deep voice explaining it to them like they're babies, a large majority of people online turned on Pirate Software, who went from being this educational talking head explaining the insides of video game mechanics and social media to now being the manifestation and representation of game publishers themselves, because he worked at Blizzard and had been making his own video games and decided to take this contrarian stance against this movement, making a video that garnered so many views speaking out against it. Pirate Software was now what game publishers were as a person. It seemed as though he was trying to keep his corporate interests, of which doesn't even really make sense to me, but basically people were under the impression that Pirate Software didn't want Stop Killing Games to garner any traction because he was worried about the video games that he had been working on with these game publishers. Pirate Software would then proceed to experience what I can only describe as the greatest fall from grace that I have ever observed on the internet ever. Obviously, there were already people who had an issue with the tone and the level of expertise that he tried to apply to the work that he did on the internet, being completely contrary to the stance that he had against Stop Killing Games, but because it was a relatively small movement at that point, this mostly glossed over, until he joined OnlyFans, a World of Warcraft guild that was comprised of many content creators, and in a hardcore raid ended up getting his entire guild wiped because of what appeared to be a misplay. Now, there is still debate as to whether or not Pirate Software actually did something right or did something wrong, if there was anything he could have done to prevent all of these characters from dying in this raid, but the fact that he took such a stubborn, arrogant stance against the notion that he had misplayed in any capacity, where many people were upset with the fact that he was the only one who survived because he left prematurely, you know, depending on how you look at it, resulted in people again having a very big bad taste in their mouth when it comes to Pirate Software, once again digging up every stupid thing he's ever said, every contrarian thing he's ever said, one of which being his stance on Stop Killing Games. This hatred by people online towards Pirate Software's arrogant personality has echoed for months and months at this point, resulting in an overall, like, there is an entire media cycle just digging up every piece of dirt of Pirate Software, saying something stupid or going back on something that he said, breaking down this entire narrative that he is this all-knowing video game expertise. He had an interview with Dr. K, where even Dr. K, a licensed psychologist, was pointing out the way that it makes sense that people are interpreting his way of speaking as arrogance because he says arrogant things that can't be argued.
I think sometimes the things that I talk about in regards to those types of things is misconstrued as arrogance or boasting, when in reality, I'm just trying to give context.
So that is the problem right there. So I want you to listen to this phrase. This gets misconstrued as arrogance, but in reality, it's this. Yeah. That is the most arrogant statement on the planet, bro. Like, tell me I'm wrong.
Okay. I don't see it that way, but all right.
Right? So, oh yeah, so you don't see it that way. You're wrong.
No.
Pirate Software would of course dismiss this as people just being soft babies. People dug up old clips where Pirate Software was speaking with a much higher pitched voice, to which Pirate Software responded with, "I went through a second puberty at age 30. No, I'm not using a voice filter. This is just my normal age. Hey, wait, aren't I 30?
Thor, founder of Pirate Software. How's your show been so far?
It's actually been amazing. It's our first time out here at Denver Comic-Con, and there's so many people, and they love the games, so it's been awesome.
Obviously, somebody who has this much arrogance in their voice to the point where they would even alter their own voice and then claim that it wasn't a voice filter led a lot of people to realize that Pirate Software might not exactly be the all-knowing cold expert when it comes to video games as he seems to be. To those of you wondering, this is my normal voice, take it up with my doctor.
Pirate Software would proceed to double down on all of his takes and take absolutely no accountability for having his entire guild wiped in World of Warcraft, which ultimately led to him being kicked from the guild. not necessarily because he played bad, because everybody ended up having their characters killed anyway, but because of his arrogant stance against his audience, resulting in too much drama for them to want to deal with. This drama would continue, with Pirate Software banning anybody in his Twitch chat who spoke of the incident, and just recently leaving Off-Brand Games, which is Ludwig's game development company, because their games were getting reviewed bomb on Steam and on social media, all because people wanted to stick it to Pirate Software as much as possible, which in my personal opinion is a teeny bit cringe, because there's hundreds of people that are working on these video games. Their work shouldn't suffer just because one person is, but that's the extent of the sort of fallback that you're going to get if you decide that you think you're too good for the audience that is kind of giving you your livelihood. It's social media 101. Come on. Pirate Software would make a number of lengthy tweets talking about the OnlyFans drama, the World of Warcraft guild incident. In one particular one, he states that he thought that he was joining the Content Guild because it was a content guild for content creators, where in reality, in his words, it was a guild that was designed to make content at any opportunity cost, of basically throwing everybody else under the bus and making an inference that, like, the reason that everybody is spewing so much hate towards him isn't because he did anything wrong, but rather because it was giving them clicks and viewership to farm such drama, which again is just arrogant. Ross Scott, the guy who started Stop Killing Games, just the other week uploads a video titled The End of Stop Killing Games. This is before PewDiePie and Jacksepticeye shouted out people to support the movement, and it ultimately ended up getting the million signatures that it was seeking to get. And he spends the better part of half of the video talking about Pirate Software, in an effort to try to debunk some of the mischaracterizations that Pirate Software made in his original video, but also pointing out the fact that Pirate Software was too big of a figure to ignore, and his video talking about mischaracterizing or ultimately encouraging people to not support this movement hurt it to some capacity. Pirate Software, seemingly incapable of spending even 5 minutes being likable by anybody on the internet ever, would make a tweet responding to Ross Scott in which he states, basically refuting the notion that his opinion piece on Stop Killing Games did anything to stop people from supporting it. For whatever reason, ultimately making a graph in which he graphed the number of signatures that Stop Killing Games had garnered in an effort to try to show people that, hey, look, my video didn't even do anything to hurt this movement, which is stupid. Your video mischaracterizing the Stop Killing Games petition and encouraging your audience to not support the legislation has 1 million views, and that the lack of support obviously isn't going to be represented by a graph only showing the people who signed up for it. You can see PewDiePie and Jacksepticeye plotted on the same graph, encouraging people, resulting in hundreds of thousands of signups. What? I feel like you would need a graph where you told people to sign it to then see the number of people who would have signed it if you supported the notion, and then subtract that amount, which is, you don't have that data plot. This is stupid. Pirate Software would proceed to continue with his doubling down and his arrogant stance and his seeming desire to always be the contrarian, furthermore getting into even more drama with people like Moist Critical and what have you, but I'll save that for another video. Ultimately, the important thing is, thanks to people like Moist Critical, PewDiePie, Jacksepticeye, Ross Scott, and everybody else, the petition has reached the 1 million signatures that it was aiming to garner in that time, and can now be brought in front of legislation in an effort to hopefully get them to make it so that game publishers that release games continue to support those games, or make it so that they aren't just deleted one day, which I imagine is good. I still don't understand what Pirate Software's deal is. Nowhere in this does it state that it would hurt live service games, and why would you even interpret it as such? A bunch of gamers coming together for their love of video games in an effort to try to make it so they can play these games more for longer, even without the development of the publisher behind them. Surely that's just going to result in games being better or better supported, or continue living long after they should. In what world does this kill games? I don't get it, man.
That's everything I could cover on the topic. If you guys have any more information or your own opinions, please let me know down in the comments. It's right below the subscribe button. Remember to check out Into the AM and get an extra 10% off for their 4th of July special, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Spisu.